There is a real valley you can walk into today, just south of the old walls of Jerusalem. It has a name. And roughly 2,000 years ago, a teacher stood near a place like this and used its name as a warning. When that warning was carried into English, the translators reached for a single blunt word, hell. But here is what almost no one is told. The word your English Bible prints as hell was never one word. In the original languages, it was four. And the man who first stamped hell across an English Bible had never read three of them in the tongue they were written in. By the end of this, you'll know exactly which of those four words you're standing in right now. I want you to hold one question for the next 20 minutes because the whole investigation turns on it. When this teacher warned his listeners about judgment, he did not gesture at the sky or at some abstract realm beyond the stars. Again and again, he named a location, a specific ravine that his audience could see from the city gates, a place with a history so dark that its name had already become a curse. Why would anyone warn about the next life by pointing at a spot on a map you could reach before sundown? Hold that. We are going to walk all the way down into it. But to understand why he chose that word, we first have to deal with a stranger problem. The word hell itself, which doesn't come from the Bible at all. Start with the English. The word hell is not Hebrew, it is not Greek, it is Germanic. It travels into English from the Old Norse and Saxon North, from a root that meant, very plainly, to cover, to conceal, to hide away. The same root sits as quietly underneath ordinary English words like whole and to hull a seed, to cover it over. In the mythology of the Norse, that hidden, covered over place beneath the world had a keeper, a figure named Hel, who ruled the realm of the unremarkable dead. So when early translators looked for an English word to carry the foreign idea of the place of the dead, they reached for the nearest thing their own culture already had, the shadowed underworld of their ancestors. They borrowed a pagan word to translate a sacred text. Now that borrowing was not malicious. Every translator does it. You reach for the closest familiar word. But watch what happens over the centuries. The English word hell arrives already soaked in its own imagery. A cold, hidden, covered over land of the dead. Then later, medieval art and medieval poetry pour fire and devils and torture into that same vessel. By the time most of us hear the word, we are not picturing anything from the ancient Near East at all. We are picturing a 14th century painting, much of what the modern mind sees when it hears hell. The descending circles, the pitchforks, the demons assigned to specific sins, the eternal torture chamber engineered for maximum suffering. That architecture comes largely from a poem, from Dante, writing around the year 1320, and from the painters and preachers who followed him. It is a magnificent work of imagination, but it is imagination, it is not the text. So if hell is a borrowed northern word wrapped in medieval paint, what did the Bible actually say? To answer that, we have to put the English aside completely and go back to the oldest layer, the Hebrew of the Old Testament. And the first surprise is that there is no fire there at all. Open the Hebrew scriptures and search for the place of the dead, and you will not find a lake of fire. You will find a word, Sheol. It appears around 65 times. And here is the thing that stops most people cold. Sheol is as not a place of punishment. It is the destination of everyone. When the patriarch Jacob believes his son is dead, he says he will go down in mourning to Sheol. He is not afraid of being tortured He expects to go there because that is simply where the dead go, the righteous and the wicked alike. The Hebrew picture is quieter and stranger than fire. It is a shadowed, silent place beneath, a land of dust and faint memory, where the dead are gathered and the living do not return. One of the wisdom writers puts it bluntly, in Sheol, where you are going, there is no work, no planning, no knowledge. It is less a furnace than a grave the size of the whole earth. Now here is where the translation problem becomes visible. You can actually catch it happening. Take the King James Bible, the version that shaped the English-speaking imagination for 400 years. It takes this single Hebrew word, Sheol, and translates it 3 completely different ways, depending on the verse. Sometimes it prints grave, sometimes it prints pit, and sometimes, for the very same word, it prints hell. Think about what that does to a reader. In one verse, Sheol is rendered as the neutral grave, and you picture a quiet burial. 3 pages later, the identical Hebrew word is rendered hell, and now you picture flames. The reader has no way of knowing it was the same word the whole time. The fire was never in the Hebrew. The fire was added by the choice of an English word. And notice the direction the Hebrew imagination always moves. The dead do not rise up into a furnace. They go down, down into dust, down into the deep, down to the place beneath the place. This was not a peculiar Israelite idea. The neighboring cultures of the ancient Near East pictured the dead in much the same way. A dim, dusty house below, from which there is no climbing back. The Hebrew writers share that geography, but they add a strange and stubborn note into it. Here and there, a psalmist dares to say that even Sheol is not beyond reach, that if he were to make his bed in the depths, something still holds him there. That is the texture of the oldest layer, not a torture chamber, a shadowed grave, and a faint refusal to believe that the grave gets the final word. There is no devil with a pitchfork anywhere in sight. So if the oldest layer of the Bible has no burning hell, only this gray, universal land of the dead, then where did the heat come from? The answer begins when Hebrew thought collides with the Greek language. And that collision has a name too. Roughly 2 to 3 centuries before Jesus, Jewish scholars translated their Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the common language of the Mediterranean world. We call that translation the Septuagint, and it became the Bible that many people in Jesus' day actually read. Now, those translators faced the same problem we just watched. What Greek word do you use for Sheol? They chose Hades, and that choice quietly imported a whole second mythology. Because Hades, to a Greek ear, was not a neutral word. It was the name of the underworld of Greek myth, and the name of the god who ruled it. So now the Hebrew idea of the silent land of the dead is wearing a Greek mask. The same way the English word hell smuggled in Norse mythology, the Greek word Hades smuggled in Greek mythology. Layer upon layer, each translation tints the picture with its own culture's afterlife. In the New Testament, Hades is still mostly the realm of the dead, the place where the dead wait. There is one famous scene where a rich man and a poor man named Lazarus both die, and the rich man finds himself in torment in Hades, separated by a great chasm from comfort. People often read that story as a literal map of the afterlife, but notice it is told as a parable, a teaching story with a sharp moral edge about wealth and indifference. And it uses the cultural furniture of its time. The chasm in the story is fixed not to satisfy our curiosity about the architecture of the underworld, but to make a point about a chasm that already existed in life. The one the rich man dug every day by stepping over a starving man at his own gate. We should be careful about turning a parable into an architectural blueprint, and even more careful about quarrying it for floor plans of a place it never set out to describe. And at the very end of the story, in the book of Revelation, something remarkable happens to Hades itself. Death and Hades are said to be thrown into the lake of fire. Read that slowly. Hades is not the final fire. Hades is something that gets thrown into the fire. The realm of the dead is itself emptied and ended. So Hades cannot be the eternal furnace of the popular imagination. It is the waiting room, and even the waiting room has an expiration date, which leaves us with the word that actually does the heavy lifting. Because when Jesus warns about judgment, Sheol and Hades are usually not the words on his lips. He reaches for a third word. And unlike the other two, it is not abstract at all. It is a place you could walk to. Here is the word, Gehenna. It is the single word Jesus uses most often when he warns of final judgment about a dozen times in the Gospels, and it is not a concept. It is a postal address. Gehenna is Greek for a Hebrew phrase, G Ben Hinnom, the valley of the son of Hinnom, a real ravine running along the southern and southwestern edge of Jerusalem. You can stand in it today. And that is the answer to the question I asked you to hold at the very beginning. Why did Jesus warn about judgment by pointing at a place on the map? Because for his listeners, this particular valley already meant the worst thing they could imagine. Centuries earlier, this valley had been the site of something the Hebrew prophets describe with horror. A place called Topheth within the valley, where, according to the records, children were offered in fire to a foreign god named Molech. The scriptures do not whisper about this. They condemn it in the strongest terms they have. A reforming king named Josiah deliberately desecrated the place to make sure the practice could never resume there again. And the prophet Jeremiah declared that this valley will one day be renamed the Valley of Slaughter, a monument to judgment. Stand in it, and you understand why it became the image. Picture the geography for a moment. Jerusalem sits high, a city of white stone catching the light. And along its southern flank, the ground falls away into this steep, narrow ravine. A boundary, a literal edge of the city, the line past which the holy ground ends. To climb out of the valley was to climb up toward the temple. To be cast into it was to be thrown outside, downward away, into the one piece of land the city remembered with shame. A place once given over to burning children had become, in the collective memory, the precise opposite of the presence of God. The outside, the discarded, the place of fire and refuse, and the unburied. When a teacher wanted a single word for everything you do not want your life to come to, he did not need to invent one. The city had already built it out of its own worst history and left it lying just beyond the gate. That is the genius of the choice, and it is exactly what the English word hell erases. Hell sends your mind up into the clouds of myth. Gehenna sends your feet down a path you could actually walk. A reforming king's reach and a prophet's curse had turned a valley into a verdict. Do you see what has happened to the word by Jesus' time? Gehenna is no longer just a geographic feature. It has become a byword. When a first century listener heard Gehenna, they did not picture a poem by Dante. They pictured the most defiled, accursed ground they knew, a real valley soaked in real memory of fire and death. Jesus didn't invent a torture realm. He pointed at the one place his audience already understood as the image of utter ruin, and he said, that is what you are risking. Now, I have to be honest with you about one detail, because honesty is the whole point of this channel. You may have heard that Gehenna was Jerusalem's perpetually burning garbage dump, that fires smoldered there constantly, consuming trash and bodies, and that this is why Jesus used it as an image of unquenchable fire. It is a vivid story. It might even be partly true, but you should know that the earliest clear source we have for the burning garbage dump idea comes from a rabbi writing around the year 1200, more than 1,000 years after Jesus. We do not have solid first century evidence for a permanent dump fire there, so I'm not going to sell you that detail as fact. The valley's reputation for horror is well documented. The perpetual bonfire is a later tradition. Hold them apart. What we can say is this: the phrase attached to Gehenna, that their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched, is itself a quotation. Jesus is borrowing the closing image of the prophet Isaiah, a picture of corpses and judgment. The language is fierce and final, but it is the language of a prophet's vision pointing at a real valley, not a tour of an underground torture facility. So that is 3 of the 4 words. The silent land of Sheol, its Greek mask Hades, and the burning valley Gehenna. But there is a 4th word hiding in the New Testament. It appears exactly once, and it isn't aimed at human beings at all. The 4th word is Tartarus. It surfaces in a single verse in one of the shortest letters in the New Testament, and you have almost certainly never heard a sermon on it, because in English it too was simply flattened into hell. Tartarus is borrowed straight from Greek cosmology, where it was the deepest pit imaginable, a prison far below even the realm of the dead, the place where in the old myths the rebel titans were chained after they made war on the gods. It was not where ordinary people went when they died. It was a maximum security vault for defeated powers. And in that one New Testament verse, the word is used in exactly that sense. A place where rebellious angelic beings are said to be held, bound in chains of darkness, awaiting judgment. Not the dead in general, not unfaithful people. A holding cell for spiritual rebels. That distinction matters more than it looks. Because once you see that the single most infernal sounding word in the New Testament is not even aimed at human beings, you realize how much careful detail the flat English word hell has been quietly bulldozing. 4 authors, 4 words, 4 jobs, and a single translation choice that treated them as interchangeable. So here is the strange truth. The English word hell has been used to translate at least 4 distinct ideas: a universal gray grave, its Greek mask twin, an accursed valley of judgment, and a bottomless prison for fallen angels. 4 words, 4 different pictures, one blunt English label flattening them all into a single furnace. Now we wrap everything back together. And when you see the 4 side by side, the entire familiar picture rearranges itself. Put the 4 words on one table: Sheol, the silent dwelling of all the dead, no fire, no sorting. Hades, the same idea in Greek dress, a waiting place that is itself eventually destroyed. Gehenna, a real, named, accursed valley used as the image of final ruin. Tartarus, a one-time prison for rebel spirits. 4 separate words from 2 languages, written across many centuries, each carrying its own world. And the English translators, doing the best they could, with the tools they had, pressed all four flat under one syllable, hell. Then medieval art set that syllable on fire. So what is it, then? The final reality these words point toward. And here I want to do something the gentle thing most channels avoid. I want to tell you honestly that sincere, careful readers of these same texts have landed in 3 different places, and I am not going to pretend the question is closed. Some hold to the traditional view, a conscious, unending separation, and point to the strongest language of unquenchable fire, an undying worm. Some argue for what's called conditional immortality, where the language of destruction and perishing is taken at face value to mean exactly that. A real end, the second death, not an endless torment. And some hold to a hope of ultimate restoration, reading the lake of fire as something that consumes and purifies, rather than preserves in agony forever. Each side has serious texts. Each side has serious scholars. Each side has to wrestle with the fact that even the word eternal, the Greek aionios, carries a debate about whether it means endless duration or belonging to the age to come. I am not going to hand you a verdict and tell you to stop thinking. That would betray the whole investigation. What I can hand you is something better. The ability to read the word for yourself and to know which of the 4 words is in front of you. So go back to where we started, standing at the edge of that real valley outside Jerusalem. The next time you read the word hell in an English Bible, I want one small thing to happen in your mind. I want you to pause and ask, which word was this underneath? Was it the silent grave of Sheol, the Greek masked Hades that gets thrown into the fire, the accursed valley of Gehenna that you could walk into, or the angel prison of Tartarus? Because the cost of not asking is enormous. When we read a 14th century painting back into a 1st century word, we don't just get a detail wrong. We let someone else's imagination overwrite the text, and then we mistake the painting for the scripture. The ancient writers were doing something far more careful and far more interesting than we were ever told. They had 4 words. They meant 4 things. And the man who used the most frightening of them did not point past the stars. He pointed at a valley with a history on the southern edge of a real city and asked his listeners to choose a different road. If this changed how a single word lands for you, that's the entire reason this channel exists. So subscribe and stay for the investigation. I've put together a free 1-page study guide, 4 words, 1 map that lays out all 4 terms, every verse, side by side, so you can check this yourself. The link is in the description. And if hell turned out not to mean what you were told, wait until you see what the original word for heaven actually points at. That's the next stop. I'll meet you there.